We pick up part 3 of the lecture by introducing the new wave of immigration. And this wave of immigration occurred between 1880 and 1924. And the groups that primarily built this wave of immigration were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And this created a change in the complexion of American immigration, as these groups had distinct cultures and languages. These were different than the English and Germanic languages. These were different than the primarily Protestant religions. We started to see that our new arriving immigrants brought with them, again, Catholicism, also languages that were tied into with modern day Eastern Europe. You had some Slavic languages. You had individuals coming from a notably different culture. And during this time, we saw a population explosion. We saw how immigration was really driving population growth and urbanization in the United States. You could see in the graphic how this time period swells. And if you recall from one of the early images we saw in this lecture, this was a time when the percentage of the American population reached its highest in terms of foreign-born. During this period, as our groups were moving into cities, we saw the evolution of these very strong ethnic enclaves. Many of these enclaves evolved again through involuntary segregation as groups like Italians, groups like Russians, individuals coming from the historic Austrian-Hungary area were more or less limited in where they could go in the cities, so they grew these strong Slavic, Italian, Russian neighborhoods. And then at the end of this wave, we saw a contraction in immigration. And this is a very important question we ask, why? And we're going to revisit that in just a few minutes when we look at policy. This image is from modern-day Locust Point in Baltimore, Maryland, where Fort McHenry is today. They're right outside of Fort McHenry is a large rail terminal, and between the mid to late 1800s and about 1920, this was a major destination for immigrants. This was the second largest immigration terminal behind Ellis Island in New York. During this wave of immigration, we also improved our technology when it comes to photographing and writing about immigrants. Jacob Riis documented the immigration situation in Lower Manhattan, and he talked about 5-cent lodging, where immigrants were packed into these tenement houses that were originally constructed to house up to 8 families, were now housing a dozen people in each of those individual units. So within these houses, we'd have over 100 people within the one tenement building. The end of this era came about through strict policy, and the graphics on your screen now, the one on the bottom right, shows you the contraction in the immigration waves. On the top right, you see a funnel with Uncle Sam holding a 3%. The end of this era was brought about in 1924 through what's known as the Johnson-Reed Act. And this act established quotas, saying that 3% of a foreign-born population would be permitted in going forward. This act, this law, was in direct reaction to the new immigrants coming in, through the immigrants coming from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from Italy, from Greece. These groups were seen as increasingly threatening to the political establishment. The reasons for the act: one was eugenics. Eugenics, which was growing not only in the United States but other places around the world, where a strong native identity was critical through the economic and cultural success of a country. The idea that these new groups arriving were threatening that American identity. There was a push for reducing cheap labor. The idea that people were coming from other countries and stealing our jobs. Now, these 2 points may sound a little bit familiar to what you hear today in the 21st century. And as these ideas, as this negative rhetoric gained momentum, it made its way through politics into this Johnson-Reed Act. Now, the Johnson-Reed Act established these 3% quotas. But what was unique about these 3% quotas was that it was based on an 1890 census, all the way back to the beginning of the third wave of immigration, all the way back to when our groups from Southern and Eastern Europe were relatively small. So it all but eliminated future immigrants coming from these countries. Now, countries like France, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands. There was fewer push factors out of those countries, so immigration naturally declined from those places. But these areas where immigrants were seeking opportunity in mass, places again like Italy, Greece, Austria, Hungary, Russia, they were all but forbidden from entering the United States. Only 3% of the group that was here in 1890. So during this contraction of immigration, when we all but closed our borders, we saw an internal movement of people, an internal movement known as the Great Migration. And this was a time when African Americans moved out of the South and into northeastern and Great Lakes cities. 6 million people moved during this period. Now, beginning in 1916 and ending in 1970, we saw the pull factors of industry supporting two major war efforts, World War I and then World War II. So this need for labor and the reduction in immigration caused the United States to look internally. In the South, we had a surplus of labor, especially as agriculture became more mechanized, there was less opportunity to work. We also had millions of people that were needed in our Northeast, in our Great Lakes industrial cities. So during this time, we saw this mass internal migration of African Americans out of the South into our bigger cities, replacing the former immigrant labor. In 1965, we began our most recent wave of immigration, known as the ethnic kaleidoscope. And you could see the countries highlighted here are very different than the countries that supplied people in our previous waves. Today, most of our immigrants are coming from Latin America and Asia. And in 1965, the United States government eliminated the quotas that were established through the Johnson-Reed Act, saying that these racial and ethnic quotas were an embarrassment to the United States. As a result of overturning the Johnson and Reed Act, as a result of the Immigration Act of 1965, our country has become much more diverse, as the pool of people now coming from Latin America and Asia and mixing with our immigrant groups that have gone back generations. We see that our country demographically is changing. By 1990, 25% of the country was either a racial or ethnic minority. Today, we're hovering right around 40%. By 2050, it's estimated that the United States will be what's called a majority-minority nation, meaning that there is no single majority racial or ethnic group. Today, that racial or ethnic group is white, and about roughly 60% of the U.S. population is white. By 2050, that percentage will drop under 50% as our Hispanic population grows, as our African American and Asian populations also grow. You can see in this graphic how Latin America in red has really exploded in more recent decades, and then Asia in purple has also risen dramatically since this Immigration Act of 1965. And a more recent graphic shows us again the large growth in Latin America and the Caribbean and also Asia as our foreign-born population continues to grow. As these groups are entering the United States, we revisit an image that we used to start this lecture. The growth of transnational landscapes are cultural landscapes that are continually recreated through the synthesis of these many groups coming together. So in the following images, we'll see how these different transnational landscapes evolve based on who is arriving when. This is a group or an image that we saw earlier, and the synagogue on the right and the black and white image of a street scene in East Baltimore from the early 1900s shows this Jewish immigration wave where Jews arriving from Europe arrived in Baltimore and began to establish themselves, begin to recreate a landscape. Also in Baltimore, we have what's called Greek Town in southeast Baltimore. On the right, you see this business called Greek Village, and on the left, you see a Hispanic business. This image shows us how not only a transnational landscape evolves when one group arrives, but how polyculturalism evolves as another immigrant group arrives much later. This idea of invasion and succession is taking place in Greektown in East Baltimore. One of our more iconic enclave neighborhoods, Chinatown in Lower Manhattan. Again, you could see the influence of the immigrant groups arriving here in the United States and synthesizing with the existing culture. Chinatown, LA, many similar symbols, many similar streetscapes that you would find in New York, but in a new setting. Pershing Square in Westwood, LA, also known as Tarangelis, because of the large group of Iranian immigrants that moved into this part of the city in the late 20th century. So much so, or the Iranian or the Persian group was so strong that you actually see a phone book that is not written in American, but it's written in Farsi. Boyle Heights, LA, reflects a large Mexican immigration flow. Similar occurrence happening in Echo Park. Koreatown in Los Angeles is perhaps the largest and most powerful enclave economy in the United States, where nearly every business is owned by a Korean American or a Korean American family. The symbols that are found in this part of the city strongly reflect that Korean influence. In a more recent wave of immigration, we see Ethiopia sending people across the world as Ethiopia went through a famine and political collapse in the 1980s. As a result, Ethiopian immigrants were searching for opportunities in parts of the world, and many of them arrived in LA, recreating and transforming a pocket of LA from a former cultural presence into what's referred to today as Little Ethiopia. So as you can see, immigration is occurring in the United States. We're constantly including new groups of people within our population. And as these new groups arrive, they leave their mark. They blend with the existing culture. They syncretize. They create a new landscape, a new place within our cities, within our surrounding communities as well. So immigration, again, is a very powerful force that will continue to recreate the American population, both as far as demographics, when we look at the percentage and the number of who's here, and also our culture and our cultural landscapes, the places where we interact on a day-to-day basis.